June 1942. Over the endless expanses of the Central Pacific, Japanese Zero fighters ruled the skies. Their lightweight construction, long range, and unmatched maneuverability allowed Japanese naval aviators to sweep through American formations, kill escorts, and vanish again before counterattack. For years, American pilots in F4F Wildcats felt the sting, outturned, outclimbed, outmatched. The Zero was called the unsinkable escort fighter, a demon of the Pacific that could dive, climb, and manipulate the fight at will. In those early days, senior U.S. Navy strategists accepted a grim truth: until we built something new, we would lose air superiority. The turning point began when Grumman delivered the prototype F6F in late 1942. It was not graceful, not sleek, but it was powerful. Its robust airframe, Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine, and heavy armament made it a beast built for attrition, not finesse. The HELLCAT wasn't designed to outturn the Zero, it was designed to outlast and outgun it. By mid-1943, the first F6F-3s were deployed aboard carriers in the Pacific and immediately tested their mettle. Pilots like Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell relayed shocking results. The HELLCAT was fast, sturdy, and brutal in a dive. It could absorb damage and keep flying. It could press the attack where other fighters would fall apart. Word slowly spread among Japanese pilots that this new American plane was not another Wildcat, it was something different. In air engagements over the Solomon Islands and Guadalcanal, HELLCATs withstood return fire that would have destroyed a Zero, then turned and punished the opponent. Japanese airmen whispered of fighters that took hits and kept going, of gunners who never missed, of a machine that seemed to embody death itself, sleek, silent, and fatal. As more HELLCATs entered frontline squadrons, American pilots refined tactics. The F6F's structural toughness allowed aggressive maneuvers forbidden to more fragile fighters. Dive, pull up, roll, throttle back, HELLCATs practiced boom and zoom with impunity. Japanese Zeros, trying to turn inside them, found themselves outgunned, outmassed, and in the killing zone. Japanese pilots began to record internal radio chatter, that HELLCAT's bulletproof. They called it Shinigami in whispers, death with wings. The nickname was born not from propaganda but from dread. After battles like the Marianas and the Philippine Sea, Japanese combat records noted horrific kill ratios. In the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, HELLCATs decimated the Japanese air arm with ease. Veteran Japanese pilots began to speak of facing F6Fs not as adversaries but as grim specters descending from above. They claimed that when the HELLCATs appeared on the horizon, the sky turned as if morning. But the nickname had more meaning than mere fear. The HELLCAT matched the Zero's advantages where it mattered and exploited its weaknesses. While the Zero had light armor and fragile fuel tanks, the HELLCAT carried self-sealing tanks, armor plating around vital areas, and redundancy in systems. A single 7.7 mm fire through the Zero's fuselage could fatally cripple it. But an F6F might emerge smoking, leaking, wounded, and still safe enough to return. Over time, Japanese training doctrine changed. Pilots were briefed not to dogfight HELLCATs. They were forced to adopt boom and zoom tactics themselves when possible, but by then the balance had shifted irreversibly. Japanese leaders feared deploying Zeros into HELLCAT zones. Entire squadrons were held back rather than risk annihilation. In survivor memoirs decades later, some Japanese aces confessed they counted HELLCATs first and prayed they never met them head-on. They called them Tensha no Sha, angels of death. The HELLCAT's reputation spread beyond Japan. Allied pilots used the moniker in briefings and debriefings. In intelligence reports, they translated it as death with wings and began to lean into the legend. The nickname stuck, not because it was literal, but because it captured how the HELLCAT felt in combat: relentless, unforgiving, and final. In one air encounter over Formosa in late 1944, a Japanese pilot radioed he'd been hit multiple times, the canopy shattered, control surfaces damaged, and yet the HELLCAT behind him still managed to shoot him down. He radioed, "I thought I was dead already." That became a common refrain. By late 1944, the HELLCAT had scored over 5,000 aerial victories. The Japanese air arm, once dominant, was shrinking under the weight of numbers, attrition, and the uncanny threat of the F6F. The nickname Death with Wings became part taunt, part legend, part confession. In isolated Japanese airfields, pilots huddled over maps and whispered of the plane that had turned the tide. The HELLCAT had not just been a tool of war. It became a psychological weapon. When Japanese pilots saw a HELLCAT formation approaching, morale cracked. Engines sounded too steady, bullets flew too cleanly, the fighter silhouette too deadly. That alone gave HELLCAT pilots a supernatural edge before rounds were fired. And so when you hear accounts of dogfights in the Pacific, know that a nickname like Death with Wings was not born of ego. It was forged in blood, fear, and surprise. The HELLCAT was not perfect. It had its flaws. But it achieved what it was always designed for, not simply to compete with the Zero, but to break its dominance forever. Japanese pilots called it Death with Wings because in their skies, it came to mean precisely that, a machine that carried death and wore wings. February 1944. The USS Bunker Hill launched its first wave just after sunrise. HELLCATs roared off the deck two at a time, engines bellowing as they clawed into the sky above the Caroline Islands. Somewhere on the horizon, Japanese A6M Zeros were forming up for a counterstrike. But this was no longer the war of 1942. These were no longer undertrained greenhorns in underpowered Wildcats. The skies now belonged to the Grumman F6F HELLCAT, and to the men who knew how to wield them like sledgehammers wrapped in aluminum skin. In the early months of the HELLCAT's combat deployment, it had already begun shaping the outcome of the Pacific theater. The fighters' statistics weren't just impressive, they were rewriting doctrine. With 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns mounted across its wings, the F6F didn't aim to poke holes in enemy fuselages. It aimed to tear them apart. A single short burst could reduce a Zero to burning confetti. But it wasn't just about firepower. Pilots were finally flying something that gave them the edge, in survivability, altitude, range, and psychological impact. One of the early myths among Japanese pilots was that the HELLCAT was invincible. Many swore they had seen their comrades score direct hits, only to watch the American fighter shrug it off, loop around, and return fire with surgical cruelty. This idea spread like wildfire. In one after-action report, a downed Japanese airman stated plainly, "It doesn't fall when it's hit. It hunts us." The HELLCAT's thick armor plating and rugged internal design allowed it to fly with ruptured fuel tanks, shredded control surfaces, and half its engine disabled. That meant American pilots who once feared one-on-one duels could now chase them, and finish them. As the war escalated, so did the HELLCAT's role. By mid-1944, it wasn't just patrolling airspace around carriers, it was leading bombing raids, escorting torpedo planes, strafing ground targets, and destroying Japanese airfields. It was so dominant in the air that U.S. naval strategy shifted entirely around it. Carrier groups were now organized with larger CAP, combat air patrol, formations to intercept enemy bombers before they could even locate the fleet. The HELLCAT didn't just stop Zeros in the air, it erased their staging points on the ground. But perhaps the most brutal advantage was how quickly it trained killers. American pilot training programs, using simulators, dogfight lectures, and real-world flight time, produced thousands of competent aviators every month. Meanwhile, Japan's pool of skilled veterans had dwindled, and their replacements, rushed through training, were ill-prepared to face the HELLCAT. In dogfights, F6Fs would dive from altitude, fire a single burst, and pull out without ever giving their opponents a chance to react. Kill footage from the time show precision attacks and almost no wasted ammunition. There's a reason the Japanese began calling the plane, Death with Wings. It wasn't poetic license, it was a field observation. The F6F didn't show mercy. And by design, it didn't need to. Its climb rate outpaced most Japanese interceptors. Its dive recovery let it outmaneuver even an Oscar or Tony fighter. And its range meant it could follow Zeros back to their airstrips. Pilots often described the plane not as a fighter, but as a predator. Fast. Efficient. Cold. In one notorious engagement off the coast of the Philippines, a flight of 4 HELLCATs encountered over 30 Japanese fighters. Rather than disengage, they split into 2 teams and used slashing attack runs from above. When it was over, 21 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. All 4 HELLCATs returned to their carrier. That wasn't an anomaly, it was becoming routine. Squadron logs filled with similar accounts: 2 HELLCATs engaged 12 enemy, destroyed 8. No losses. Over and over. Across the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, wherever the HELLCAT flew, the skies cleared. Veteran Japanese pilots knew better than to engage HELLCATs unless they had a clear tactical advantage. But that moment rarely came. Radar-guided interceptions, team formations, and disciplined training made HELLCAT squadrons nearly unbreakable. The Americans learned to hunt in pairs, covering each other's blind spots, using radio comms to coordinate attacks. Zeros, once elegant masters of maneuver warfare, were now flying caskets. The psychological impact deepened. Some Japanese pilots, facing increasing pressure and overwhelming losses, reported HELLCAT sightings as a warning before attack. Others noted that even when F6Fs didn't fire, their mere presence disrupted formation cohesion. Planes scattered. Orders were lost. The presence of HELLCATs in the sky became synonymous with death. And with that fear came fatal hesitation. By the end of 1944, the U.S. Navy had deployed over 12,000 HELLCATs across the Pacific. They weren't just winning, they were dominating. Carrier task forces became floating fortresses, launching strike groups that could defend themselves with no escort required. American naval aviation no longer fought on even terms, it hunted, eradicated, and returned with minimal loss. The HELLCAT was no longer a countermeasure. It was the standard. And Japanese pilots who had once ruled the air now faced something far worse than defeat. They faced extermination from the skies by something they couldn't stop, couldn't outrun, and couldn't outfight. The legend of death with wings wasn't invented by newspapers. It was whispered in cockpits, muttered in bunkers, and scribbled into hastily written letters home. The HELLCAT was the last thing many Japanese pilots ever saw, and they knew it. June 1944. Over the Marianas, HELLCATs prowled the skies in layered formation, stacked like a floating shield above the American fleet. In their cockpits were pilots with less than 6 months in uniform but hundreds of hours in simulators, mock dogfights, and flight briefings. Opposite them, Japanese aviators launched from crumbling island airstrips in outdated Zeros, many of them teenagers with barely 40 hours of real flight time. The asymmetry was staggering. And it showed. In one day alone, June 19, during the infamous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, F6F HELLCATs recorded 300 confirmed kills. The Japanese would never recover. This was where the HELLCAT's legend crystallized, not as a workhorse, but as a psychological weapon. By now, even the most experienced Japanese pilots were wary. Gone was the arrogance of early 1942. Gone was the joy of open-sky dueling. Every mission now began with a gut-wrenching uncertainty: would they make it back? Not because of tactics, not because of odds, but because of that plane. In briefings, they were told to avoid HELLCATs at all costs, to disengage immediately, to stay alive. Even kamikaze recruits were cautioned. Reports spoke of the black ones that cannot be outrun. Pilots described F6Fs as if they were sentient predators, always overhead, always watching, always waiting to strike. This shift in mindset was more than fear, it was systemic collapse. Radio logs from surviving Japanese squadrons captured the mood clearly. Call sign chatter that once brimmed with confidence now filled with dread: they are here. HELLCATs, dive angle north. No escape. This wasn't the psychology of an elite force, it was survivalism, raw and frantic. Where once they had fought with precision, now they sprayed fire, hoping to scare the enemy off. But HELLCAT pilots didn't scare. They calculated. They executed. And they climbed again. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was now functionally obsolete. It lacked armor, self-sealing tanks, dive brakes, and radio discipline. It was still agile in close turns, but HELLCAT pilots never let it get that close. They learned to fight on their terms. Hit from above, break away, climb, loop, and return. Boom and zoom. Efficiency, not flash. Kill fast. Move on. over and over again. Dogfighting had become a system. And Japanese pilots, young, and that is how a machine, bolted together in factories in Bethpage, New York, became death with wings in the eyes of an empire. It wasn't just killing planes. It was breaking the will of the pilots inside them. October 1944. The skies over the Philippines were boiling with smoke, tracer fire, and the roar of propellers. Japanese air units were desperate to stop the advancing U.S. Navy fleet, and the Imperial High Command was beginning to take a fatal gamble: suicide tactics. Kamikaze raids were becoming more common. Japan had moved beyond traditional air combat. But even in this final, brutal phase of the war, the F6F HELLCAT held the line. And it didn't just hold it, it crushed it. HELLCATs intercepted kamikaze formations with ruthless efficiency, tearing them apart before they could reach the American fleet. To understand the scope of what the HELLCAT achieved, you have to look at its role in fleet defense. Carriers like the USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Intrepid were vulnerable giants. Their aircraft elevators, flight decks, and refueling bays made them irresistible targets for enemy suicide bombers. A single explosive-laden Zero could punch through the deck and cripple a $45 million warship. So the burden of defense fell almost entirely to the HELLCAT's flying cap, combat air patrol. In the days leading up to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, HELLCAT pilots were flying up to 6 sorties per day, often in tight 4-man teams, coordinating through early radar signals and verbal confirmation from picket ships and destroyers. They launched hours before incoming raids and would sometimes spend an entire mission just patrolling, waiting, staring out over the vast ocean for the dot on the horizon that meant trouble. And when the call came, bandits inbound. Sector north-northwest, they reacted like muscle memory. Full throttle. Nose down. Intercept. What made the HELLCAT so lethal even against suicide planes was its ability to close distance rapidly and shred its target before it could reach the fleet. Kamikazes didn't maneuver. They didn't dogfight. They came in fast and straight. But HELLCATs could dive faster, absorb damage if they overshot, and re-engage from above. Pilots learned to fire short, controlled bursts, aiming for the fuel tanks or engine block. Some even coordinated dual attacks, with one pilot flushing the kamikaze into a kill lane while the other finished it off. And it worked. In a single 24-hour window during the Leyte operation, HELLCAT squadrons destroyed over 130 incoming aircraft, many of them on suicide runs. Pilots like Cecil Harris and Alex Fraissiou scored multiple kills within minutes. And still, they launched again. HELLCAT squadrons became synonymous with vigilance, not just violence. The Japanese hoped suicide attacks would bypass American defense systems, but the HELLCAT was a system in itself. The Japanese response? More desperation. They began flying bombers at night, hoping to slip past Cap under the cover of darkness. But the Navy responded with night fighter variants like the F6F, 5N, equipped with radar pods and advanced navigation systems. Suddenly, even the night wasn't safe. Pilots like Butcher Hare led experiments in night interceptions, silent, sudden, lethal. The HELLCAT had expanded its domain from day to night, from offense to defense, from duels to strategic deterrence. And with each kamikaze it destroyed, its legend grew darker. Japanese radio logs from late 1944 reflect this tension. Some suicide pilots requested permission to delay their attacks, citing enemy shadows in the clouds. Others described seeing black ghosts falling from the sun to intercept their approach. These weren't metaphors. These were HELLCATs. And the fear was no longer confined to regular airmen. Even kamikaze units, pilots who had accepted death, feared they wouldn't make it to their death. That's how deeply the HELLCAT had gotten into the enemy's psyche. And the kill ratio only widened. While the P-51 Mustang often takes the spotlight in Europe, in the Pacific, no fighter matched the raw lethality of the HELLCAT. Its final kill ratio stood at 19-1. But more importantly, it denied Japan the one hope it had left, a shock campaign of kamikaze victories that could force a negotiation. The HELLCAT didn't just win air battles. It stopped strategic threats before they became real. Back on the carriers, the reverence was obvious. Ground crews painted victory tallies on fuselages. Pilots named their planes things like Death Dealer or Black Cat. But the most common artwork was simple, a pair of black wings, spread wide, claws out. Because that's how they saw the F6F. Not just a machine, but a presence. Something that stalked the skies and killed without remorse. By the final months of the war, the nickname, Death with Wings, wasn't an exaggeration. It was doctrine. U.S. intelligence picked up intercepted Japanese training documents that advised new pilots to avoid direct contact with HELLCATs, except in the gravest emergency. A suicide pilot, a man already prepared to die, was warned to avoid a duel if possible. That tells you everything. The HELLCAT never sought glory. It didn't win beauty contests. It wasn't sleek like a Spitfire or fast like a Lightning. But it was there. On every carrier. In every fight. From the Gilbert Islands to Okinawa. And every Japanese pilot who lived long enough to talk about it remembered what it looked like, angled wings, black nose, guns sparking in the sun. Because by then, it wasn't just a plane. It was the full weight of Allied air power given shape. It was justice in the sky. It was retribution. It was death. With wings. February 1945. The island of Iwo Jima burned like a furnace under American shellfire, and above the blackened sand, the air was thick with smoke, flak, and the engine whine of F6F HELLCAT circling like vultures. The Pacific campaign had become a brutal grind, island by island, fortress by fortress. But through it all, one constant remained in the sky, the HELLCAT. Not because it was perfect, but because it could endure. This is where the legend of Death with Wings stopped being metaphor and became lived experience. Because on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the final drives toward the Japanese mainland, the HELLCAT was no longer just a dogfighter, it was a symbol of inevitability. What separated the HELLCAT from every other fighter in the Pacific wasn't just design, it was adaptability. On the ground, Japanese airfields were being bombed out of existence. In the air, Japanese pilots were getting younger, less trained, and increasingly fatalistic. Meanwhile, HELLCAT squadrons were evolving. They flew in coordinated waves. They integrated night patrols, reconnaissance, and close air support. And they could do it all with brutal efficiency. The plane that once countered the Zero was now supporting invasions, intercepting suicide bombers, and escorting bombers to targets deep inside enemy territory. Over Iwo Jima, the numbers were staggering. American radar stations would detect incoming kamikaze formations, and within minutes, dozens of HELLCATs would launch to intercept. Pilots described it as reaping. The kamikazes came in high, fast, determined. The HELLCATs came in higher, faster, merciless. And it wasn't a fair fight. In one engagement, 15 kamikazes tried to breach the screen toward the USS Saratoga. Only one got through. The others burned in midair, cut down by tracers and .50 caliber bursts before they ever saw the carrier's deck. But the job wasn't just defense anymore. It was total suppression. F6Fs were now outfitted with bombs, rockets, and cameras. They would sweep in low across the treetops of Okinawa, delivering airstrikes on dug-in pillboxes, then pull back up and rejoin cap. No other aircraft in the American arsenal did that kind of multitasking with such consistency. HELLCATs were workhorses, but also apex predators. And the Japanese knew it. Even the sight of them at low altitude would cause panic. Ground crews would abandon airstrips mid-refueling. Pilots would refuse takeoff. The threat wasn't just that you might be shot down, it was that you'd never even make it into the air. Psychological warfare wasn't part of the HELLCAT's design brief. But it became one of its strongest assets. Survivors from Japanese air groups captured after Okinawa repeatedly testified to their fear of the F6F. Not just its speed or power, but its presence. The way it seemed to always know where you were. The way it flew straight and silent until the moment of attack, then exploded into violence. Like a sword out of the sun, one said. Another described it as a monster with 6 mouths of fire. These weren't metaphors. They were attempts to explain how a single machine could unravel your nerve before you even touched the throttle. And perhaps the most chilling impact came on the home islands. By spring 1945, HELLCATs were participating in raids over Kyushu and Honshu, escorting B-29s and conducting ground attacks on radar stations, fuel depots, and supply convoys. Japanese civilians, long told the Empire would protect them, began to hear the HELLCATs growl overhead. They couldn't always see it, but they knew what it meant. Air superiority. Total domination. The edge of defeat. Because once the HELLCATs were flying over your capital, the war was already lost. American newspapers reported on the kill ratios. Pilots were interviewed. Squadrons were celebrated. But the numbers, 6,477 aerial victories to only 270 combat losses, don't tell the real story. The real story is what the enemy felt. And what they felt was helplessness. No room to maneuver. No time to adjust. Just the sudden, sharp clap of gunfire from above, and then flames. By now, even kamikaze squadrons were requesting escort, just to make it to the fleet. The irony was grotesque. Pilots willing to die still feared dying too early. And what did they fear? HELLCATs. Death with Wings wasn't just a nickname. It was a reputation backed by every blackened fuselage, every intercepted mission, every carrier that stayed afloat because of those 6.50s. So when historians talk about turning points in the Pacific, they often mention Midway, or Leyte Gulf, or Iwo Jima. But beneath those headlines is another truth: the HELLCAT turned the war not in one moment, but by never losing one. Again and again, day after day, it broke the enemy's rhythm. It took away initiative. It denied options. It hunted and it held. It was not the flashiest fighter. It didn't make pilots into legends like the Mustang or the Spitfire. But it made survivors. And in a war like the Pacific, survival was victory. The Japanese learned to recognize the engine's note, the wing's angle, the sun glint off the canopy. And every time, they knew, the fight was already over. Because this plane wasn't there for show. It was there to end things. Cleanly. Quickly. Finally. That's why they called it Death with Wings. Because for the last year of the Pacific War, that's exactly what it was. July 1945. The war was nearing its end, but the sky over Japan was still a battleground. And even in its final weeks, the F6F HELLCAT flew with the same relentless precision it had brought to every island chain in the Pacific. By now, the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm was barely functional. The elite squadrons of 1941 were gone. The airfields were cratered. The pilots were exhausted. But the HELLCATs didn't relax. They didn't slow down. Their missions now focused on total air denial, destroying anything with wings before it could leave the runway. This was the final chapter of Death with Wings, and it was absolute. What made the endgame different was how methodical it became. The US Navy had overwhelming air superiority. HELLCATs were flying deep inland missions, beyond radar coverage, targeting fuel convoys, hangars, ammo dumps, even barracks. It was no longer a contest. It was a purge. And it was surgical. Pilots would be handed photographs of a building at dawn and be back by lunch with nothing left of it but dust and splinters. This was what air dominance looked like when it was perfected, not just outnumbering the enemy, but denying them any opportunity to fight back. Japanese command knew it. Desperation bred last-ditch designs, rocket planes, ramming units, suicide boats. But the sky? That belonged to the HELLCAT. Every new weapon Japan tested was intercepted, observed, and eliminated, usually before it became operational. American pilots would report 2 intercepts. Minimal resistance. No aircraft returned fire. Again and again. A script written in gunpowder. The psychological toll was massive. Surrender wasn't just driven by the bomb or by the blockade, it was the sheer hopelessness of ever regaining control of the air. Civilians fled cities at the sound of engines. Anti-aircraft crews abandoned posts before the enemy even arrived. Some Japanese commanders began burning their own aircraft rather than allow them to be destroyed by American fighters. Because to be caught unprepared was to be humiliated. The HELLCAT wasn't just destroying planes. It was erasing pride. And the HELLCAT itself? Barely changed. The same design that debuted in 1943 was still flying unchanged in 1945. That's how far ahead of the curve it was. It didn't need to evolve, only to endure. Engineers had created a plane that could outclimb, outfight, and outlast anything Japan had fielded. And for 2 full years, it had done exactly that. By VJ Day, the numbers were staggering. Over 75% of all aerial victories by U.S. Navy pilots had been scored in HELLCATs. 307 aces had made their names in its